Kellen Trent stood at the observation window of the sleek transport ship, staring out at the swirling mass of stars. The galaxy stretched before him like an infinite ocean, vast and untamed. Yet within that ocean, two factions, the Ulthar Empire and the Unity Coalition, had drawn a line in the sand. Their tension had reached a boiling point, and if a delicate peace wasn't forged, the resulting war would reshape everything. His pulse quickened. The assignment was not one he wanted, but it was one that humanity, in its wisdom or folly, had entrusted him with. He had spent years as a negotiator, navigating the turbulent waters of diplomacy, always keeping a professional distance. But now, those skills would be tested like never before. He'd heard the whispers of the galaxy, of how humanity, small as it was called upon to mediate between two forces that had torn the cosmos apart for centuries. It was absurd, really. Kellen couldn't help but feel the weight of expectation bearing down on him. "You okay?" The voice came from behind, pulling him from his thoughts. Kellen turned to see his assistant, Asha, standing in the doorway. She was a quick-witted, no-nonsense woman with a sharp mind, and though Kellen had been reluctant to work with anyone, he trusted her implicitly. She knew his past, his struggles, and how much he hated these situations. "I'm fine," Kellen replied, though his voice betrayed him. His eyes flicked toward the distant peace station where the negotiations would take place. "It just feels like we're throwing a match into a powder keg." Asha nodded grimly. "You knew this wasn't going to be easy. Both sides hate each other, Etherin especially. But you can do this, Kellen. You've done it before." He wanted to believe her. He really did. The truth, however, was far darker. The scars from his past, his wife and daughter lost in an interplanetary conflict, still haunted him. He had sworn never to get involved in any war again. But here he was on the front lines of a potential catastrophe, forced to mediate between two factions on the verge of annihilation. He had always been an advocate for peace, for finding the common ground between opposing forces. But now he wasn't so sure. The ship descended slowly toward the station, its metallic hull gleaming under the distant glow of a nearby star. The peace station itself was a marvel of engineering, an ancient relic retrofitted for galactic diplomacy. It hung silently, a neutral meeting ground that had seen more tension than peace in recent years. Even from this distance, Kellen could feel the electricity in the air. The station was a powder keg, and he was the fuse. As the ship touched down, a low rumble reverberated through the walls. The atmosphere was tense, thick with the unspoken dread that filled the air whenever two opposing forces came face to face. The Ulthar Empire, with its militaristic iron-fisted rule, and the Unity Coalition, a fractured alliance of democratic worlds that could barely keep their own people united. It was clear that both sides wanted something from this meeting, but no one was sure what they were willing to give up to get it. The ramp lowered with a soft hiss, and Kellen stepped onto the station's cold metallic floor. The air was sterile, the hum of the engines a constant reminder of the warships circling in orbit, ready to strike at a moment's notice. As Kellen moved forward, he could already sense the eyes upon him, alien eyes scrutinizing him, weighing his every move. Humanity, despite all its accomplishments, was still the new kid on the galactic block, and its presence here was more of a curiosity than a promise of peace. A delegation from the coalition awaited them at the entrance, led by one of their top diplomats, Riva Kale. She was a woman of impressive stature, with sharp, angular features and an air of restrained confidence. Her gaze locked onto Kellen's, and for a brief moment he saw a flicker of doubt. But then it was gone, replaced by a professional smile. "Mr. Trent, welcome. We've been waiting for you." The tension in the room was palpable. Kellen had a fleeting sense that the peace he was about to broker could very well shatter before it even began. He swallowed hard, meeting Riva's eyes. "I'm not here to make promises. I'm here to make sure we don't destroy everything, for all our sakes." And with that, The door to the negotiation chamber closed behind him, sealing them all in a room where every word could mean the difference between life and death. Kellen's boots echoed loudly as he walked down the cold, metallic corridor. His eyes flitted between the faces of the various diplomats and military officers gathered in the peace station's main hall, all of them too busy with their own concerns to acknowledge his presence. The walls, adorned with holoscreens displaying planetary systems and galactic maps, made the room feel like a war room, not a place for delicate negotiations. As the group made their way into the heart of the station, Kellen's nerves only grew more tense. The scent of polished steel and the low hum of the station's engines seemed to press in on him, reminding him of how fragile this situation was. Every step he took felt like he was walking deeper into a trap, and he was unsure whether he was meant to defuse a bomb or light the fuse. The first meeting was set to begin, and the stakes could not have been higher. Lord Siren, the ruthless leader of the Yulthar Empire, was already seated at one end of the large conference table. His presence was suffocating, even from a distance. Tall, with pale skin that almost seemed to shimmer under the dim light, Siren's eyes gleamed with a cold intelligence that bordered on insanity. Every inch of him screamed control, from the way his fingers rested on the table to the way his deep, gravelly voice filled the room when he spoke. There was no doubt that he considered this entire exercise beneath him, but he was here, and that was enough for Kellen to know that he'd have to be on his best game. The other side of the table was filled with members of the Unity Coalition, but Kellen barely had time to register their faces before the conversation began. He took his seat at the center of the table, trying to ignore the wariness radiating from everyone around him. Riva Kale, a tall and stern diplomat from the coalition, was positioned next to him. She gave him a quick, tense glance before turning her gaze toward Siren. Lord Siren, Kellen said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of caution. I trust you understand the importance of these talks. We are here not to debate ideology, but to ensure that the galaxy doesn't slip into total destruction. Siren's eyes narrowed, a slow, contemptuous smile creeping across his face. Diplomacy, human style, he mused, leaning back in his chair. What a quaint concept. You think you can reason with us? That you can talk your way out of a war that's been centuries in the making? Kellen's fingers clenched involuntarily, but he forced his body to relax. I don't pretend to know what's in your heart, Lord Siren, he said evenly, but I do know that war never brings the victory people imagine. It brings ruin. I'm here to help us avoid that. Before Siren could respond, an aide entered the room, her face pale as she handed Kellen a datapad. He read it quickly, his stomach sinking. There's been an incident, he said aloud, the words hanging heavily in the air. A ship belonging to the coalition has been destroyed in an unprovoked attack. The room went deathly quiet. Siren's eyes glinted with a cold, calculated interest. That was fast, he said softly, almost to himself. I didn't think your people were so eager to start a war. Kellen's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment where everything could spiral out of control. He took a deep breath and met Siren's eyes, trying to keep his composure. Let's not jump to conclusions, Kellen said, raising his voice slightly. We don't know who was responsible for this attack yet. It could very well be an attempt to sabotage these talks. We need to remain calm. Riva Kale stood, her face tight with restrained fury. Calm? A ship was destroyed, lives lost. If the Empire is behind this... Enough, Kellen interjected, his voice cutting through the rising tension. We're not helping anyone by pointing fingers right now. We need to gather information before accusations start flying. We're here for peace, not to escalate this situation. But it was already too late. Siren's smirk widened as he leaned forward, clearly enjoying the spectacle. The human is right, of course. Your precious peace is fragile. Perhaps, after all, war is inevitable. You can't keep the galaxy from its true nature. Before anyone could respond, the lights flickered briefly, a subtle but disconcerting sign that something was wrong. Kellen's instincts screamed at him to be ready for anything, but before he could fully react, a loud explosion reverberated through the station structure. The walls shook violently as the ground beneath them quivered. The holoscreens flickered and went dark. For a moment, there was silence, save for the distant sound of alarms and hurried footsteps. Panic surged through the room. "We need to get to the emergency bunkers," Riva said, her voice sharp with urgency. But Kellen was already on his feet, scanning the room. The peace talks, it seemed, were already being torn apart, and this was only the beginning. The emergency alarms blared throughout the peace station, drowning out any hope of coherent conversation. The walls groaned under the strain of the blast, and the lights flickered in rhythm with the erratic hum of the station's failing power systems. Kellen's heart raced, his mind scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. The explosion had been no accident. It was deliberate, a signal to both sides that the fragile peace being brokered here was already under threat. "Everyone, move," Riva Kale shouted, grabbing Kellen by the arm and pulling him toward the nearest exit. Her face was flushed with fear, but there was an edge of determination in her voice. Kellen allowed himself to be tugged forward, but his eyes scanned the room. Lord Siren, still seated at the table, seemed eerily calm despite the chaos around him. His eyes gleamed with a cold satisfaction as he watched the others scramble. There was no sign of panic in his demeanor, just the confidence of someone who had prepared for the worst. "We need to find out what happened," Kellen said through gritted teeth. "This was no random attack. Whoever did this wants us to fail." Riva shot him a glance, her face tense with frustration. "You think this is some kind of sabotage? We're in the middle of a peace summit, Kellen. The last thing we need right now is paranoia." But Kellen knew better. He had seen this kind of play before. When a group was on the brink of a breakthrough, the shadows moved to destroy it. "We can't afford to ignore it. Not now." They reached the security office, where a technician was frantically trying to stabilize the systems. The explosion had caused significant damage to the communication arrays, cutting off contact with the fleet above. A few others were there too, representatives from both factions, all speaking over one another in a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Report," Kellen demanded, stepping forward. The technician looked up, his face pale with dread. The blast, it originated from one of the Coalition's own ships, a frigate stationed just outside the station's perimeter. "It's been destroyed. We're not sure how or why yet." Kellen's mind raced. This was worse than he had feared. The Coalition ship had been a symbol of unity, a joint operation between their disparate factions. If it was destroyed from the inside, it could be the spark that ignited the entire galaxy into war. "Who would do this?" Riva asked, her voice strained. "The Ulthar wouldn't risk this kind of provocation. It's not their style." "I'm not so sure," Kellen replied, his gut telling him that the Ulthar were more than capable of such a move. Lord Ziren was a master of manipulation, and he had already shown his distaste for the peace talks. But Kellen couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. The sabotage was too well coordinated, almost too perfect. Before Kellen could elaborate, another explosion rocked the station, this time much closer. The shockwave sent everyone tumbling to the floor, and the lights flickered out completely. Silence followed, save for the distant crackling of alarms. Kellen pulled himself up, his pulse hammering in his ears. "We need to get to the command center," he said urgently. "Now." They stumbled through the darkened hallways, Kellen leading the charge. There was a sickening tension in the air, the kind that came when everyone suspected betrayal, but no one knew who the enemy was. The deeper they went into the station, the more the atmosphere thickened with fear. People scrambled past them, soldiers and civilians alike, trying to reach the designated evacuation zones. Kellen's mind was a blur of thoughts, racing through possible scenarios, trying to connect the dots. Who had the means and the motive to carry out such a calculated attack? Could the Ulthar be behind this after all? Or was there something even more sinister lurking in the shadows? As they reached the command center, Kellen saw the chaos unfold before him. The screen showed erratic readings, systems failing, security breaches, and the destruction of another coalition ship just outside the station's reach. Something was wrong. Someone wanted this summit to fail, and they were willing to do whatever it took to ensure that it did. Then Kellen saw something that made his blood run cold. A small, almost imperceptible message flickered across one of the screens. The human diplomat will not survive this meeting. The galaxy will burn. Kellen's breath caught in his throat. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to destroy the peace talks. They were targeting him specifically. "We're being set up," Kellen muttered under his breath. Riva's eyes narrowed. "Set up? But why you?" "I don't know yet," Kellen replied, his thoughts racing. "But whoever's behind this has a reason, and they won't stop until they get what they want." Just as he finished speaking, a figure stepped into the command center, his silhouette barely visible against the dim emergency lighting. It was Lord Siren. He looked unfazed, almost amused. "Isn't this fun, human? Watching everything you've worked for unravel?" Kellen's heart skipped a beat as Lord Siren stepped forward, his presence imposing even in the dim, flickering emergency lights. The Ulthar leader's eyes glinted with a chilling, almost predatory light, and his lips curled into a smile that sent a cold shiver down Kellen's spine. "You," Kellen muttered under his breath, barely able to conceal his shock. "You knew about this." Siren raised an eyebrow, the subtle motion almost mocking. "Knew? No. I didn't know that the human diplomat would become such a fascinating pawn." He strode toward the central control panel, his long strides echoing in the silence. "But I certainly have my suspicions, and now here we are." Riva, standing beside Kellen, stepped forward, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. "What do you mean?" "This station is falling apart, and you're making jokes about it." Siren's gaze shifted to her, cold and calculating. "Not jokes. Observations. After all, you're too quick to jump to conclusions, Riva. This isn't a simple attack. It's far more intricate. This is about more than just peace or war. This is about control." Kellen's mind raced as he tried to piece together the implications. He had been suspicious of the explosion, but now he was beginning to see the pattern. There was something more to this, something personal. Someone was pulling the strings, and the peace talks were a smokescreen for a deeper agenda. But why target him? What role did he play in this grand game? Siren turned away from the control panel, his lips curling into an unreadable smile. "You're asking the wrong questions, Kellen Trent. You see, your greatest strength is also your greatest weakness. You talk about peace, but in doing so, you make yourself the ultimate target." Kellen's stomach twisted. He couldn't deny the truth in Siren's words. He had become the symbol of humanity's attempt to mediate, to assert their relevance on a galactic scale. And with that power came a vulnerability that his enemies were now exploiting. "What do you want?" Kellen demanded, trying to mask the unease in his voice. "Control," Siren said simply, as if the word itself was enough to explain everything. He crossed his arms, his tone turning almost bored. "The galaxy is a chaotic, fractured mess. What better way to unify it than to collapse the existing order? If war breaks out here, humanity will be blamed for the failure. The Ulthar Empire will take advantage of the ensuing chaos, as we always have. And once we rise, you will be the scapegoat, the one who could have stopped it but failed." Kellen's blood ran cold as the weight of Siren's words sank in. The Ulthar Empire didn't just want to win. They wanted to break everything apart, using humanity as a convenient excuse for their rise to power. His role in this summit had made him a target, a symbol of a fragile peace that could be shattered in an instant. And if he wasn't careful, the galaxy would blame him for the disaster that would follow. "You think you've already won," Kellen said, trying to regain some composure. But you've underestimated one thing. This isn't just about you. This is about all of us, every species in the galaxy. We can still make this work." Zarin laughed, a low, rumbling sound that echoed through the room. "Can you, Kellen? Can you really? You're an idealist, a dreamer. But dreams don't stop war. And you're not ready for what comes next." Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness, the screens and lights flickering out entirely. Kellen's breath caught in his throat as he heard the soft hum of something ominous moving nearby. It wasn't just the station that was in jeopardy, it was everyone on it. "Riva," Kellen said urgently, grabbing her arm. "We have to move now." She nodded, her face grim, and together they made their way to the command center's secondary exit, just as another explosion rang out in the distance. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, the thudding of boots on metal floors. "We're too late," Kellen muttered. "They're already inside." The distant noise of chaos outside the command center grew louder, gunfire, shouts, and the unmistakable sounds of heavy artillery. It was happening. The peace talks had been nothing more than a carefully orchestrated setup for a bloodbath. They reached a hidden corridor that led to a maintenance bay at the back of the station. As they hurried down the narrow passage, Kellen's mind raced. If they didn't act fast, they'd be trapped with no way to fight back. "Where's Azirin?" Riva asked, her voice tense. "I don't know, but he's already made his move," Kellen replied, his mind still working over what had happened. "And I think I know what this is about." "The sabotage?" Riva asked. "No, worse," Kellen said, his voice tightening with realization. "This was never about sabotage. It's about making sure that the war begins, with humanity as the catalyst. And we've walked straight into their trap." Kellen's pulse quickened as they moved through the dim, narrow maintenance corridors of the peace station. The flickering emergency lights cast long, jagged shadows on the walls, and the sounds of distant explosions and gunfire echoed through the halls, reminding him that time was quickly running out. They needed to act fast, but every move felt like a gamble. The enemy had already made their play. Now it was Kellen's turn to keep the game alive. "Where are we headed?" Riva asked, her voice tight with tension. "Somewhere we can think," Kellen replied, trying to steady his breathing. "We need to find a secure comm station. I've got a few ideas, but I need to contact someone on the outside. We have to warn the coalition fleet." "Warn them?" Riva shot him a look. "About what?" "About this, about the trap they're walking into," Kellen said, his eyes hardening. "If they don't act now, the Yulthar Empire will use this attack as the justification they need to invade. We can't let that happen." Riva's expression shifted to one of understanding, but also fear. "Then we need to make sure we don't get caught in the crossfire. If they think we're still in the station." "I know," Kellen cut her off. "That's why we need to move quickly. The longer we stay here, the more likely it is they'll find us." They rounded a corner, only to be met with a blur of movement. Kellen's instincts flared as he grabbed Riva and yanked her back into the shadows. Just as a squad of Ulthar soldiers swept past them, their armored forms clanking against the metal floor. The soldiers were scanning every room, their senses sharp, their weapons ready for anything. The fact that they hadn't detected Kellen and Riva yet was nothing short of a miracle. "They're looking for us," Reva whispered, her voice barely audible. Kellen nodded grimly. "They want us alive, but not for much longer. They'll need us to be their scapegoat, to make it look like humanity was the aggressor in all this." Riva clenched her fists, the frustration evident on her face. "So what? We let them use us. We run and hide while they frame us for a war we didn't start." "No," Kellen said sharply. "We fight back, but we do it smart. We have to play our cards right, or we'll be trapped in their narrative." They waited in silence until the soldiers passed, then continued their way through the maintenance tunnels. Kellen's mind raced, but his thoughts kept coming back to one thing: the message he had seen on the command center screen earlier. The human diplomat will not survive this meeting. The galaxy will burn. The words haunted him, and he knew they weren't just threats. Whoever was pulling the strings had no intention of letting the peace talks succeed, and they had made him the target. After what felt like hours, they reached the comm station, a small, secure facility tucked deep within the station's guts. Kellen quickly activated the console, but when the screen flickered to life, he was greeted with static and interference. He cursed under his breath, hitting a few keys to try and bypass the malfunction. "This thing's been sabotaged," Reva said, frustration building in her voice. Of course they'd make sure we couldn't communicate with anyone. "Just give me a second," Kellen said, his fingers flying over the keypad. "If I can just reroute the signal." The sound of footsteps echoed outside the station, growing louder by the second. Kellen's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly ducked behind a row of maintenance crates, pulling Reva down beside him. Their breathing was shallow as they waited, barely daring to make a sound. Through the thin crack in the crates, Kellen could just make out the silhouette of a familiar figure, Lord Siren. He was flanked by two heavily armed Ulthar soldiers, his gaze scanning the room as though he already knew they were hiding somewhere. "You think you can run forever, Kellen Trent?" Azarin's voice was like ice, cold and dripping with amusement. "You're nothing more than a pawn in a game you don't understand, but I'll make sure your sacrifice is remembered." Kellen's hand tightened around the weapon he had taken from the security office earlier. He wasn't ready to go down without a fight. Reva turned to him, her eyes filled with resolve. "What's the plan?" Kellen's mind raced. Azarin had them cornered, but Kellen had never been one to back down. He had to buy time, time for the fleet to arrive, time for the truth to be revealed. If Azarin thought he could manipulate the situation, Kellen would show him just how dangerous a cornered diplomat could be. "We hit him hard and fast," Kellen said in a low whisper. "We take out his guards, then use the station system to send a distress signal to the coalition fleet. But we need to move now." Reva nodded. "Let's do it." Kellen's eyes met hers with a look of fierce determination. He wasn't going to let Siren win. Not today. It was time to take control of the narrative, and for that, he would need more than words. With a final glance toward the Ulthar leader, who was now moving away from the room, Kellen sprang into action. Kellen's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched behind the crates, his hand tightly gripping the weapon. The footsteps of Azarin and his guards grew fainter, but Kellen knew it was only a matter of time before they'd be back. The tension in the air was suffocating. Every sound felt amplified, every second dragging on like an eternity. "We don't have much time," Reva whispered, her voice barely audible as she leaned close to Kellen. "We need to act now." Kellen's mind raced as he weighed his options. The station was in chaos, the war between factions inching closer with every passing minute. If they didn't get to the communication system soon, the Ulthar would have all the justification they needed to destroy everything. "Stay low," Kellen said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "We'll take them by surprise. We don't need to kill them, just incapacitate them long enough to send a distress signal." Reva gave him a sharp nod, the familiar fire in her eyes. She was ready. Kellen watched through the narrow gap in the crates as Azarin and his guards moved into a small storage room at the far end of the corridor. The door slid shut behind them, cutting them off from view. Kellen knew they had only moments before the Ulthar leader would realize they were gone. The odds were against them, but they had no choice now. "On my count," Kellen said, adjusting his grip on the weapon. 1, 2. Before he could say 3, Reva sprang into action. With the precision of someone who had seen too many battles, she dashed across the hallway, silent as a shadow, and took cover behind the corner of the room where Azarin and his guards had entered. Kellen followed, his movements quick but deliberate, staying low to avoid detection. They reached the storage room just as the door slid open again. Viren's guards stepped out, talking among themselves, their backs to Kellen and Riva. They were close, too close to make a clean shot. Now Kellen hissed. Without hesitation, Reva lunged forward, her body moving with a fluidity that was almost unnatural. She tackled one of the guards to the ground with a swift, brutal blow, knocking the wind out of him. The second guard reached for his weapon, but Kellen was faster. He took him down with a well-placed shot to the chest, sending the Yulthar soldier sprawling backward. The Viren himself emerged from the room just as the guards fell, his eyes wide in shock. His calculating demeanor faltered for the briefest of moments before it hardened again. "You think you can stop me, human?" Azarin's voice was icy, his tone full of contempt. "I'm not here to stop you, Azarin," Kellen said, leveling the weapon at him. "I'm here to make sure the truth gets out." The Yulthar leader's lips curled into a smile, though it was thin and cruel. "Truth? You think the truth matters now? The galaxy is already on the edge of war. The Coalition fleet is moments away from launching an assault on my empire. You're nothing but a pawn in a game that's already been decided." Kellen's grip on the weapon tightened. "Then why are you here, Viren? Why aren't you on your ship, making sure the final move goes according to plan?" Viren stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Kellen's face. "Because you are the one I need to destroy, Kellen Trent. You are the symbol of everything that will fail. Without you, without the peace talks you so desperately clung to, the war will begin. You will be the reason the galaxy burns." "You've underestimated humanity," Kellen replied, his voice cold. "You've underestimated me." Riva's eyes flicked to Kellen for a split second, a silent question in her gaze. He nodded, giving her the signal. Without hesitation, Reva rushed forward, using the confusion to her advantage. She grabbed the Yulthar's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to the ground with a swift, well-executed move. Azarin grunted in surprise, but did not resist, knowing full well that even he couldn't outmaneuver Riva in hand-to-hand combat. Kellen quickly moved to the console, frantically typing in the codes he had memorized earlier. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he bypassed the security protocols, each keystroke bringing them closer to sending the distress signal. But the countdown on the screen reminded him how much time they were losing. If they didn't act now, it would be too late. "There's one thing you didn't count on, Azarin," Kellen said, his fingers flying across the keys. "The Coalition doesn't need peace to survive, but we need it to thrive." Azarin remained eerily calm beneath Riva's grip. "You're a fool. Do you really think the Coalition will come to your aid? They will only see your failure, just as I will. There will be no one left to save you." Kellen's fingers hovered over the final key, ready to initiate the signal. His mind was clear now, he knew what had to be done. With a final press, the message was sent. The last vestige of hope flared inside Kellen. He knew it wasn't over, not yet, but he had taken the first step. "Now we wait," Kellen said, his voice firm. Riva held Azarin firmly, not daring to let him move, as the tension in the room thickened. The game had changed, and this time, Kellen wasn't just a pawn. He was a player. Kellen leaned back against the console, breathing heavily as the seconds ticked by. He could feel the weight of the moment settling on him, the realization that they had done what no one else had managed. They had sent the message. The Coalition fleet would soon be on its way to the station. It wasn't a guarantee of victory, but it was the first real step in taking control of the situation. Viren, still pinned by Riva, seethed in silence. His eyes glinted with fury, but there was something else there too, something calculating, almost impressed. "You think the Coalition will come in time?" Azarin sneered, his voice sharp. "You've just made yourself a target, Kellen Trent. You've become a beacon for destruction." Kellen didn't flinch. He knew Azarin was trying to provoke him, but he wasn't about to give the Yulthar leader the satisfaction. Instead, he turned to Riva, his voice steady. "Keep him there. If he tries anything, take him out." Riva gave him a nod and tightened her grip on Axiren's arm, ensuring he couldn't move. The Yulthar leader's arrogance seemed to have deflated somewhat, though his eyes still burned with a dangerous intensity. "You're a fool, human," Axiren said, his tone cold but laced with a deep, bitter amusement. "You've set the stage for a war you won't be able to stop. The galaxy is already spiraling toward chaos, and now it's your turn to fall." Kellen took a deep breath, locking eyes with the Yulthar leader. "That's where you're wrong, Axiren. Humanity may be young in the galactic scheme of things, but we're not as naive as you think. You may be able to manipulate the game, but you've underestimated how far we'll go to protect what's ours." Varen's lip curled into a sneer. "You still don't get it, do you? The peace talks, the diplomatic efforts, they were never about peace. They were always a front. I knew from the moment you arrived here that you wouldn't last. The galaxy doesn't care about peace. It cares about power, and I hold it." Before Kellen could respond, the emergency alarm blared throughout the station. The high-pitched wail echoed through the corridors, signaling a new level of urgency. The lights flickered, casting the room in an eerie, strobe-like rhythm. Kellen's mind immediately jumped to the worst possible scenario had the Yulthar already launched their offensive. Riva's eyes flashed in warning as she quickly assessed the situation. "They found out we sent the signal. They'll be coming for us." Kellen didn't hesitate. "We need to get out of here, now." The door to the maintenance room opened with a loud hiss, revealing a squad of heavily armed Ulthar soldiers. They moved with terrifying precision, their weapons raised and ready. Kellen's mind snapped into focus. They couldn't afford a firefight, not with the clock ticking down. Riva's instincts kicked in. She shoved Axiren toward the door, using his body as a shield to push through the squad. "Move," she shouted, her voice low and commanding. Kellen wasn't far behind, taking cover behind a wall as the soldiers turned to engage them. The hallway was filling with the sounds of blaster fire, the rapid staccato of weapons being discharged. Kellen ducked low, moving with swift, practiced movements. He knew they had to get to the central hub of the station, the one place where they could potentially override the station's security systems and buy themselves some time. "We're almost there," Kellen shouted over the din, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Riva, cover me." Riva nodded, her eyes scanning the hall, her own weapon aimed at the advancing soldiers. She fired off a few quick shots, hitting one soldier in the chest, sending him stumbling back. The rest of the squad hesitated, momentarily stunned by the boldness of their counterattack. "Now," Kellen shouted, "move." Riva dropped low, firing again, her shots hitting their marks as they dashed toward the central corridor. Kellen could see the control room just ahead, the doors beginning to close. They had to reach it before it sealed shut. With a burst of speed, Kellen pushed forward, reaching the control room doors just as they began to close. He slid through just in time, pulling Riva inside with him. The doors slammed shut behind them, and they quickly locked the access panel. "We're in," Kellen said, barely containing his relief. But he knew it wasn't over yet. They still had to stop the Ulthar from completing their mission and ensure that the message to the coalition wasn't blocked. Riva glanced over at the control panels, her brow furrowed in concentration. "We need to shut down the station's defense systems, or the coalition fleet won't stand a chance against the Ulthar." Kellen nodded. "I've got it covered. You just keep an eye on Axiren." Varen, still fuming in their grasp, hissed at them from across the room. "You think you can defeat me? The Yulthar Empire is already beyond your reach. You will fail. The galaxy will burn." Kellen didn't respond. He turned to the console and began typing furiously, bypassing the station's security protocols and initiating a lockdown on the Ulthar's access to the control center. The countdown was on. Either they succeeded or everything they had fought for would fall apart. In that moment, Kellen understood that the next few minutes would decide everything. The galaxy's fate and his own hung in the balance. The control room was tense. Kellen's fingers danced across the terminal, inputting lines of code as the countdown on the screen loomed like a ticking bomb. His heart pounded, each second stretching out before him like an eternity. Outside the reinforced walls of the room, the sounds of battle echoed, blaster fire, the heavy thud of footsteps, and the unmistakable hum of weapons charging. "We need more time," Reva said urgently, her eyes flicking toward the surveillance feeds as they scanned for signs of the Ulthar's reinforcements. "They'll breach the doors soon. We can't hold out much longer." Kellen didn't reply immediately, his mind consumed with the delicate work at hand. If he didn't disable the station's automated defense systems within the next 2 minutes, the Ulthar's forces would seize the entire station, and the Coalition fleet would be left with no way to break through. He took a deep breath, his thoughts clearing. Every system, every protocol was designed to prevent unauthorized access. But Kellen had learned the art of navigating these dangers through years of dealing with the most intricate tech the galaxy had to offer. His pulse quickened, but his hands never faltered. Behind him, Axarin growled in frustration, still restrained by Reva. The Ulthar leader was no longer speaking, but the fury in his eyes was palpable. Every inch of his posture screamed that he was scheming, waiting for the smallest opportunity to exploit their weaknesses. But Kellen couldn't afford to focus on him. He had to finish this. "Done," Kellen muttered under his breath, just as the control room doors began to rattle from the force of a massive impact. He hit the final key and the room lit up in a bright green flash. The screen flashed with confirmation. The station's defenses were now offline. A collective breath seemed to be held for a moment before Kellen turned toward Reva, his voice steady. "It's done. The Coalition fleet will be able to make their move." Reva glanced up from the security feeds, her expression grim but resolute. "Good, but we're not out of the woods yet. The Ulthar won't take this lying down." Kellen turned to the comms panel, activating the emergency transmitter. "I'll send a final signal, confirming the status and giving them our location." As he typed in the last of the details, Siren's voice rose, a venomous hiss that cut through the tension. "You're fools. You think the Coalition will come? They'll arrive, only to find a destroyed station and a galaxy on the brink of destruction. You can't stop this. You've merely delayed the inevitable." Kellen glanced at him, his lips tight but his resolve unwavering. "I don't need to stop it. We just need to give them a fighting chance." Reva met Kellen's gaze, her expression softening for a moment. The weight of their actions, the countless lives depending on them, hung between them, but there was no time for hesitation now. They'd given humanity a chance to prevail. The comms crackled to life. A voice Kellen recognized crackled through the line. "This is Coalition Command. Signal received. We're en route. Prepare for extraction." Kellen's pulse surged with a rush of adrenaline. They'd done it. They had succeeded in sending the message, and now the Coalition would respond. The war was far from over, but this was the first victory humanity had in a long while. "Copy that," Kellen said, his voice steady. "We'll hold out as long as we can." The door to the control room suddenly buckled, then exploded inward with a force that sent Kellen and Reva diving for cover. Ulthar soldiers poured in, weapons raised, their eyes filled with bloodlust. Kellen didn't hesitate. He grabbed his weapon, firing a series of shots that dropped 2 of the soldiers in an instant. Reva fired alongside him, her movements fluid, precise. But the odds were against them. They couldn't keep fighting forever. "Reva," Kellen shouted as he took cover behind a support beam. "The ship? Can you get it online?" Reva nodded, her eyes scanning the terminal in front of her. "I'll try, but it'll take a minute." Kellen's eyes flicked back to Siren, whose cold, calculating stare hadn't left him for a second. "You'll die here, human," Siren spat, his voice low and full of disdain. "No one will remember your name. No one will care." Kellen smiled grimly. I'll take my chances. Just as the Yulthar soldiers closed in, the station's emergency systems kicked in, the massive shields around the control room powering up. A distant roar shook the station's core as the Coalition fleet arrived, their ships flooding the sky like a wave of salvation. The Yulthar soldiers hesitated, looking up in horror as the shield systems began to crackle with energy. Kellen's heart leaped in his chest. The cavalry had arrived. Reva slammed her fist onto the emergency launch button, activating the station's remaining shuttle. We're out of time, she yelled. The shuttle doors opened with a whoosh, and Kellen shoved Essirin forward into the vehicle. You'll be coming with us, he said, his tone final. With a jolt, the shuttle lifted off, blasting through the station's hull and into the chaos outside. The sound of battle raged on below them, but for the first time in days, Kellen felt a flicker of hope. As the shuttle ascended into the darkness of space, Kellen looked out at the stars, his resolve hardening. The peace talks weren't over, and the road ahead would be perilous. But humanity had proven something important today. They weren't going to stand down. Not now, not ever. The galaxy would hear their voice, and humanity's future would be theirs to shape.